Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll finally be updating my guide on Ashka, the Molten Fury, and so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Ashka is a ranged DPS champion who excels in dealing damage from afar with his strong fire attacks. I think that Ashka is a really good and fun beginner champion because he has some strong long range attacks and he also has some good survival abilities. I feel that his access to a lot of movement abilities is one of his biggest strengths, since it's not only good for beginners who are learning the game, but in the hands of more experienced players, he can be very hard to catch and is able to constantly deal damage from afar while staying safe. Opposing teams typically have to commit a lot to an attack just to try to take Ashka down. In fact, this is even before I factor in his control abilities. Because he has access to a range of soft CCs and hard CCs, these control abilities, when combined with the amount of mobility options Ashka has, can really make him quite hard to pin down, especially if Ashka's enemies are new and unfamiliar with his cooldowns. Having said that though, he does have some weaknesses like not being able to efficiently heal himself, so if you can pressure him a lot at the start, it can be quite hard for him to come back into the fight if he doesn't have a support in his team. In short, I think Ashka is a really well-rounded champion with access to good damage, escapes and control. To me, he's probably one of the best champions to start with and learn all the basic mechanics and stuff if you're completely new to the game. So yeah, that was just a brief summary of Ashka as a champion. Now I will just quickly give a rundown on how this video is structured before I get into the meat of the guide. As with my older champion guides, I have split this guide up into different sections and I've included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so feel free to jump directly to a certain section that you need if you wish. I will start off the guide by looking at his abilities one by one, describe what they do and maybe talk a little bit about how I would use each of these abilities. Then we'll talk a little bit about his playstyle, like what you should be thinking about when playing him in a round and all that, before we take a look at his Battlerites options and some potentially useful loadouts and builds. Finally, right at the end, I'll just briefly talk about some champions that could go well with Ashka and just give some final notes about him before we finish. I'd like to point out that I do not have a gameplay tips section for my champion guides anymore, since I feel like some of the tips are quite repetitive from champion to champion, and so these little gameplay tips will instead pop out in the video when they are relevant, I suppose. And so yeah, with all that being said, let's begin. First off, abilities. Starting with Ashka's life click or mouse 1 ability, Fireball. This is Ashka's basic ranged projectile attack, and what it does is Ashka basically just launches a simple fireball that deals 15 damage to the enemy that it hits. If the enemy already has the ignite debuff on them, which is a damage over time debuff you can apply with other abilities which we will get into, then hitting Fireball onto them will reapply that debuff. The ignite debuff deals 8 damage over 4.5 seconds, and so when you reapply that debuff, the debuff actually deals 2 damage immediately upon reapplication, and so you can think of the debuff that is on the target as a buff to your attack power if you attack the same target, since your attacks will effectively deal 17 damage instead of 15 damage. Next up, Ashka's mouse 2 ability is Firestorm, and this is one of his biggest single target burst damage ability. What it does is Ashka will stand still to start launching up to 3 flame bolts. Each of these flame bolts deals 16 damage to the target that it hits, and it also applies the ignite debuff. Since this ability is a channeling ability which requires Ashka to stop moving, Ashka can be interrupted by stuns and the like, and he can also be easily targeted by highly damaging abilities. Therefore, definitely be careful when using this ability and try to choose wisely when you want to commit to firing these 3 Firestorm bolts in a row. If you get caught in a bad spot while you're trying to cast the ability, don't forget that you can press C to cancel the casting of the ability earlier so that you can move away from danger. Moving on, Ashka's spacebar ability is Searing Flight, and this is his main movement and escape ability. What it does is Ashka will transform into fire and jump to a targeted location, dealing 10 damage to enemies near the targeted location. Because this is Ashka's main escape ability, typically you want to keep it for emergencies and try to avoid using it too aggressively. Unless an enemy is within a few hits of dying, using it aggressively is usually not encouraged. Maybe if you know your teammate can back you up even after jumping in aggressively, then perhaps you can go for it, but I would advise against it if you're not too sure. On to Ashka's Q ability. His Q ability is Flame Strike, and this is Ashka's main AoE damage ability. What it does is Ashka will target an area, and after a short delay, fire will emerge from the ground at the area, which would damage and stun enemies that are still inside. While it can be quite hard to hit the ability considering most champions have mobility abilities that can get them out of the area quite quickly, it can sometimes be useful for making enemies use their escape abilities, and then you and your teammate can go in for the punish instead. Otherwise, waiting till the enemy has used their escape abilities before casting the ability is a good way of increasing the chances of hitting the ability. Another use for AoE abilities like Flame Strike is that it can be used for zoning your enemies. If you see an enemy running towards some health orbs, putting your Flame Strike in the area will discourage them from trying to get those health orbs, and you might perhaps be able to quickly get it before they do try again. Another good use of the ability would be to use it to contest for the orb. Since the enemy body blocking the orb from your team is a thing, you can use this ability to try to contest for the orb instead of your normal attacks, since the AoE damage cannot be body blocked. Not to mention that the ability deals 20 damage in a single burst, so it's quite helpful when trying to get that last hit off. Next up, Ashka's E ability is Molten Fist, and this is one of his control abilities. What it does is Ashka will do a little dash forward, and if it hits an enemy, said enemy will be knocked back a large distance and snared for 1.5 seconds. While doing the dash forward, Ashka is actually invulnerable for a short while, and so this is technically another one of Ashka's escape ability, since you can use it to avoid abilities or create distance between you and the enemy. For these reasons, this ability is actually one of Ashka's most versatile abilities, since you can use it creatively to suit your needs at the time. A simple and neat little combo you can do with this ability would be to put your Q or your stun a little bit behind your enemy that's just in front of you, and then knock them back into the stun area with your E. This adds a little bit more consistency into hitting your Q ability, but if you realize that you're not able to pay full attention to the match while you're trying to set up this combo, then I would recommend focusing on staying alive and playing properly first, rather than trying to set up a combo like this, since consistently hitting your M1s will net you more damage overall anyways. This combo is just something that you can do once you've practiced enough to do it without thinking too much about it. And so those were all of Ashka's abilities which doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. First off, Ashka's R ability, which uses 25 energy to cast, is Firewall. This ability is Ashka's best ability against ranged enemies because this Firewall ability allows Ashka to put up a flame wall at a targeted location that can block incoming enemy projectiles. You can still shoot through this firewall like normal, but enemies cannot. If enemies walk through the firewall, maybe if they were trying to bypass it to shoot you, then they will be inflicted with the Ignite debuff and take some damage over time. Don't forget that this debuff can be refreshed by your Mouse 1 ability as well, so this is another way of getting that debuff onto enemies, but with some added energy cost of course. If the enemies are mostly ranged champions, putting this firewall between them and the central orb will make it much harder for them to secure the central orb, and so you can use this to your advantage if your firewall is ready to be used when the orb spawns. Moving on to Ashka's EX abilities, his first EX ability is his shift space ability, Searing Fire. This ability modifies Ashka's spacebar ability so that it gives Ashka a buff called Pure Fire for 50 energy, in addition to what it already does with the base ability. This Pure Fire buff allows Ashka's Mouse 1 attacks to heal him for 15 health with each hit, and so this EX ability is actually Ashka's main way of sustaining himself with heals if his team doesn't have a support champion. There's not much to say about this ability other than to remember that you have this ability and it is an option if you desperately need some health to stay alive. Just be careful since it does cost 50 energy, and so it is very expensive to cast if you're trying to save up energy for a nice ultimate ability. Next up, Ashka's second EX ability is his Shift Q ability, Molten Chains. What this ability does for 25 energy is that Ashka will petrify all nearby enemies after a brief cast time. Petrified enemies receives a 20 health shield but is unable to move or do anything for 3 seconds. They are only allowed to move once the 3 seconds is over, or if the shield is broken prematurely, or if they were cleansed by something like Lucy's Clarity Potion. So yeah, this ability is Ashka's hard CC ability, and is extremely handy when trying to deal with melee enemies who are trying to aggressively attack you since the ability has a rather short range. If you are feeling adventurous, you can actually jump toward ranged enemies and immediately cast this ability for an easy petrify, so that's an option to consider as well if you really want to keep an enemy out of a fight for a couple of seconds. Not only is the ability useful for keeping melee enemies at bay or keeping enemies out of the fight for a short while, it is also useful for setting up combos with your teammates. Petrifying an enemy to allow your allies to set up their hard-hitting abilities is also a very good use for this ability, since all it costs is 25 energy and the enemy can't move until they are already hit by the hard-hitting abilities. Finally, Ashka's ultimate ability on the F key is called Infernal Scorch, and it is a very powerful large AoE ultimate ability. What it does is Ashka will turn invulnerable and dash forward a large distance. Enemies that are hit while Ashka is dashing forward will be dealt 36 damage, stunned for a short while, and will also be inflicted with the Ignite debuff. Enemies that continue to stand in the area of effect will continue to take 3 damage every 0.5 seconds, and so if you can keep them in the area of effect as long as possible, you can deal another 24 damage in addition to the 36 damage you already did. While that sounds like a lot of damage, enemies will typically jump out or move out of the area before they are hit by the whole extra 24 damage, but even so, the damage has already been done with that 36 damage burst and stun and ignite, and not to mention whatever damage that your allies did to them while they were stunned for that brief period as well. Ashka's ultimate ability is really strong since it does so much, and it is also hard to avoid. And so definitely try to save up for it if you can afford to, and try to make sure enemies have used up their escape cooldowns before using it aggressively and take them down with it. And so that's about it for Ashka's abilities. Let us move on now and talk a little bit about his playstyle. Ashka's playstyle is actually quite straightforward, and it is mostly just hang back and shoot from afar with his mouse ones while waiting for opportunities to use his other abilities. His Q ability is hard to land on enemies if they have their defensive cooldowns available, and his right click ability is inconsistent since it can be easily interrupted or heavily damaged while stationary. This makes his mouse 1 ability the only reliable source of damage until enemies make a misstep or are forced into making a mistake, at which point you can probably try to punish them with your mouse 2 since it is your hardest hitting single target ability. Typically, even without any escape abilities, enemies can quite easily walk out of your Q ability if you're not very good at aiming with it, and so I quite often use the Q ability as a sort of way to force enemies to use up their escape cooldowns and then follow it up with a mouse 2 onto them since they should be out of escapes by then. For his E, Shift Q, R, Spacebar and Shift Spacebar abilities, you'll just be waiting for appropriate times to use them and try not to waste them if possible. Use E to knock back enemy melee champions who have gotten close, or if you're only up against ranged enemies, you can use it as a little movement ability to perhaps dodge attacks or reposition to a better spot and so on. Against melee only teams, your firewall ability isn't that useful unless the enemy melee champions have really strong range attacks like Lucan, Thorn, Bako, or maybe even Raygon, since his E with his aerial strike Battlerites can be quite powerful if it hits you. But against ranged enemies, you want to use it as much as possible, especially at key moments. Your Shift Q or Petrify ability should be used when enemies get near as a defensive move, or you can even use it aggressively to set up combos and hugely damaging attacks. Typically, you have to waste your spacebar or E to get close enough to do this, but if you feel it's safe enough to do such a move because you feel your teammate will have your back, then it is something you can consider doing. This is only potentially worth it if your teammate doesn't have an easier way to hard CC an enemy, but if for example your teammate is Thorn or Sirius and they have way better methods of hard CCing enemies, then you can just let them do the hard CCing first, and you can instead chain your Petrify after they have used theirs for a very long CC on the enemy, or you can even just use your Q for easy 20 damage and stun. Using Ashka's spacebar ability is quite self-explanatory, but as I mentioned in the earlier part where I introduced the ability, you'd want to save it for emergencies or use it aggressively only at times when enemies are literally 1 or 2 hits away from dying at most. So yeah, just a reminder to not waste your ults too easily. On to Ashka's ultimate ability, because it is such a strong ultimate ability which can very easily swing the round to your favor or make it even more unwinnable for your opponent. I'd say you want to use it as much as possible when you find a good opportunity to use it, but just make sure that the enemy has used their escape cooldowns first to make the most out of it. And so yeah, that's mostly it for his playstyle. Now let us move on to Ashka's Battlerites options and loadouts. Because there are so many Battlerites currently and it would take a long while for me to go through and describe all of them one by one, I will just display them here, and if you wish you can go ahead and pause the video to slowly read through them before continuing with the video. And so pause now to read through the first half. And now again for the second half. Okay, now that you've read all of them, let's continue. First off, I think that other than a couple of Battlerites, most of Ashka's Battlerites are pretty strong, so you can definitely tailor your Battlerites builds to your own playstyle and also choose what you need depending on team compositions on both sides. The only Battlerites that I feel is so good that you should almost always pick it in any build is Heat, since it almost fully removes the drawback of using your mouse 2 ability by letting you move while casting it. Depending on whether you have a support champion in your team to heal you, you might need to change up your build a little bit. If you don't have a support champion in your team to reliably heal you, Battlerites like Burning Feet, Fire Ward and Inspiration are some good Battlerites to consider. Burning Feet gives you a nice movement speed boost after using your spacebar, and I think it can be quite useful since you can stay out of harm's way much easier, and this can be extremely useful in keeping your health as high as possible. My personal favourite for when I don't have a support champion in my team is Fire Ward, since the shield that you get after using spacebar can be very helpful for keeping you healthy. Some enemies are fast enough to target their attacks at you after seeing you use your spacebar, and so having this shield might reduce the damage that you might take from these attacks. Not only that, it also gives you the opportunity and safety to play a little bit more aggressively when you need to, like when you want to try to finish off an enemy or something. I sometimes take this Battlerite even if I do have a healer on my team, since it reduces the pressure on my teammate a little bit. The reason to sometimes take inspiration when you don't have a support champion is mostly for all the defensive options you have access to when you have energy. Having inspiration makes it much easier to cast your petrifies, firewalls, and your EX space ability, and so you'll be able to keep your health bar up for a lot longer than you would without the Battlerite. The reason why I didn't mention Ember Fire, even though it gives quite a large amount of healing, is because it is inconsistent. Hitting enemies with your Q can often be quite difficult unless you're playing in a way where you're always trying to set it up, and so I don't usually take this Battlerite. If it is your playstyle to try to force your enemies to take damage from your Q ability, then I suppose Ember Fire can be a pretty good pickup. I just feel like the effort is not worth the reward, and using the Q as a supporting ability rather than your main damaging ability is easier and more consistent, especially in such a fast-paced game. If your team does have a support champion who can do very well, and you feel like you can get away with taking Battlerites that will boost your damage by quite a bit, then Battlerites like Wildfire, Blaze, and Conflagration are some pretty good choices for boosting your damage. Against champions who have no easy way of deflecting your attacks, Wildfire is a very good boost to your damage from your Mouse 2 ability, so I definitely recommend taking it as a first choice. Just try to take it only if you have heat already taken, since it is quite unlikely to be able to stand there to cast 4 projectiles with your Mouse 2 without having the heat Battlerite. I wanted to put Combustion into this list too, but I feel that Wildfire is better than Combustion, and since heat is pretty mandatory, Combustion is sort of left out from these recommendations. What I would say about Combustion though is that if you want to take a Battlerite to boost your Mouse 2, but you don't want to take Wildfire, perhaps maybe because there's a Bako or Raygon in the enemy team who can reflect your projectiles, then taking Combustion might be pretty good, since it can be pretty damaging if enemies clump together. On to Blaze. I think that Blaze is a really good Battlerite, especially if you see yourself playing aggressively sometimes. Even if you're not playing too aggressively, a defensive jump with your spacebar followed by an empowered M1 is still a good way of putting Ignite onto an enemy, and you can then follow it up with more Mouse 1s for that sweet damage since you refresh Ignites with your Mouse 1s. You'll see that I have Blaze in most of my builds later, mostly because it is a good way of inflicting that Ignite debuff. About Conflagration, I find that it is super useful when it is taken against ranged enemies, since you'll be putting out a lot more firewalls when you're up against them. It makes your R ability not only a defensive one, but an offensive one at the same time as well, since you can fire up to about 3 shots or so in the time span that it is up. Generally, Wildfire would be what you're going after if you're looking for firepower, but if you have a free slot available, then Conflagration is a good pickup in addition to Wildfire. In terms of control, Ashka typically needs maybe 1 or 2 Battlerites for this, since he needs them to not only survive more easily, but also make fights easier for his team. He has a couple of Battlerites which improve his ability to control the fight, and these are Eruption, Fire Punch, Knockout, and Lava Punch. I find that Eruption is quite good, since you make it that much harder for enemies to escape the area of effect, and they will typically have to resort to using their escape cooldowns to get out. This opens up opportunities for you and your teammate to jump on the defenseless target after that, and so I like picking this Battlerite for that reason. If you manage to catch them without their escape cooldowns, then it is even easier to hit them with it for a nice 20 damage. So yeah, pretty sweet little Battlerite. Between the 3 Battlerites which improve your E Battlerite, I feel that they're all quite good, and so I think it mostly comes down to personal preference. Personally, I like having Knockout, since the stun on the enemy if you manage to hit them into a wall can be a good setup for combos and all that. Obviously, the value of the Battlerite will go up or down depending on the map, as some maps have more walls for you to knock enemies into and so on, and some maps don't have that many walls. But even so, the Battlerite can be good sometimes, especially if you have Fire Punch. With that increased dash range and knockback range, you can knock enemies almost halfway across the map and probably still knock them into a wall behind them so to stun them. If you're already in a big map like Dragon Garden Day and you really don't want to take the stun Battlerite there, then even just taking Fire Punch is pretty good on its own, since you can knock melee enemies very far back, and so they have to try to find some way to get close to you again. If you're up against multiple melee enemies, then taking Lava Punch is quite a good option, since having the 3-second cooldown reduction will mean that you'll have your E ability often enough to hopefully keep the enemy melee champions away. I've mostly covered most of the Battlerites which I think are pretty decent. Now I'll just talk a little bit about Raging Fire and Magma, which I haven't mentioned yet. I feel that the effects of Raging Fire isn't awesome enough to justify only having its effects every so often. Depending on how the rounds go, you're only looking at using your ultimate maybe 1 to 2 times in the short round, or 3 to 4 times in the long round. Only being able to shoot a couple of Firestorm bolts for 3 seconds after each of these ultimates doesn't feel like it's a lot, since people generally jump away or something after being hit by Ashka's ultimate ability. On to Magma, I think that it's not really that worth it as well, since it only deals the bonus damage when it's first applied. So that means if you already have Ignite on the enemy, then the 4 bonus damage won't be dealt if you only reapply it with Mouse 1, or as far as I understand it, even if you inflict a new Ignite debuff on the enemy with your Mouse 2. The 10% movement speed reduction isn't really that much as well, so I feel like Magma just isn't that worth it overall. So yeah, those are my thoughts on most of the Battlerites. Like I mentioned in my beginner tips video, I think you'll want to at least give a little bit of thought about what Battlerites you're using before each round, since that is a good way of understanding the champion more, and it will also help you with making sure you learn what are the best situations to use which Battlerites and so on. But in case you just want to quickly take a loadout and jump straight into a game, here are some loadouts that I use. The reasons these Battlerites are in the loadout are the same as what I explained earlier, so I'll try to avoid repeating them. But I'll also try to explain why I might take out a certain Battlerites to swap for another, and in what situations you might want to do that. So yeah, the typical build that I use for most fights is this build, mostly because it fits my playstyle. It doesn't really matter if I'm up against ranged or melee enemies, because this build is all about versatility, and all the Battlerites are useful no matter if I have a support champion in my team, or if the enemy team has a range or melee champions and so on. As I mentioned earlier, Heat is so good that I take in all of my builds, so here it is. I like the combo of Fire Ward and Blaze, since it lets me be a bit aggressive when I need to, and even if I don't need to be aggressive and I do a defensive jump with my spacebar, I have that little shield to protect me for a couple of seconds and also get a nice damage boost on my next attack, plus the Ignite debuff. The combo of Knockout and Fire Punch is how I like to play Ashka, and it is a combo that gives this build its versatility. I only recently tried this combo out more, and I found that it's super fun to use. It allowed me to set up combos nicely with my teammates, and those chain stuns and stuff that you can set up can sometimes melt your enemy's health bar really quickly. While the build I just shared can be used in almost any fight, I sometimes switch out Fire Ward for Wildfire for a little bit more oomph if I have a support teammate in my team. This build is especially useful if the enemy team has a couple of champions who doesn't have counters or reflex, because you can find instances where they will have to stand there and take your full Mouse 2 or at least try to dodge your Mouse 2 shots. In some 3 vs 3 games, and each team composition is such that the fight will probably be a stalemate most of the time, this build can be quite useful for those situations. Taking Wildfire and Inspiration will hopefully let you outvalue the enemy team over the course of a long round, and the extra value you get will hopefully give you just enough edge to win the round for your team. The Inspiration Battlerites pick will let you gain your energy faster and gives you access to more ultimates throughout the round, not to mention the firewalls, EX spaces and petrifies that you can put out as well. By now you've probably realized that I took Heat, Knockout and Fire Punch in all of my builds that I've shared, together with a couple of Mouse 2 or Spacebar related Battlerites. That's mostly just my playstyle with Ashka and how I enjoy playing him, but if you prefer, you can certainly try to make a build that's more focused around your Q ability and make it work. But to me, it's just a little bit more fiddly, and that's why I stick to this build. Certainly you can try swapping out a couple of Battlerites here and there for some of the Q Battlerites that I went through in the earlier section to tailor your build to your liking depending on the opponents you're facing and all that. But yeah, I don't have a build for that, but I'll leave it up to you, to your creativity. And so yeah, that's about it on Ashka's Battlerites and Loadouts. That was a fairly lengthy part, but we'll now move on to champions that synergize with Ashka before we finish the guide with some final notes on Ashka. On team compositions, I find that Ashka can synergize with most champions quite well, but more so with support or melee teammates I feel. That's not to say that he's not good with ranged teammates, because he is still good with ranged teammates. It's just that I think that being paired with supports or melees can bring out his potential much more. Most support champions can help Ashka by keeping him healthy, and that way he doesn't have to commit some energy to keeping his own health up. This can be very helpful in most rounds since he'll have more access to his ultimate ability, and he also doesn't have to keep worrying about building enough energy and keeping his health bar up as much at the same time. Most melee teammates are also nice for Ashka because they are naturally quite good at drawing out your enemy's escape cooldowns, so it makes it easier for you to land your Q stuns and your Mouse 2 shots. Melee teammates are also really good at drawing attention to them, and that lets you as the Ashka player to have an easier time to aim your Mouse 1 attacks and make the most out of your other abilities. So yeah, Ashka is a really fun and good champion to play and learn the game with. Once you get better with him, he's also a really good champion that can fit in most compositions, so that's really handy as well. His strong abilities and escape potential makes him very formidable in 1v1 situations, but his AoE abilities makes him very useful to have in situations where you're fighting as a whole team against the enemy team as well. because he's such a beginner friendly champion, it shouldn't take too long for you to get a hang of playing with him and being effective with him in your matches, even if you're new to the game. So I definitely recommend playing him if you're not too sure who to play first. And so yeah, that's about it for my Ashka guide. I hope you guys found it useful. Just to let you guys know, the next champion guide that I will make would be on our latest new champion, Destiny, so I hope you guys can look forward to that. From the votes on my Thorn guide a couple of weeks back, Raygon was voted to be the next updated guide after Destiny's, so you can expect an updated Raygon guide coming soon after that. By the time Raygon's guide is out, the next new champion that should be released in December 2017 would have probably been released already, and so the guide after Raygon's would be on that new champion before we resume updating guides on older champions. Because I like to involve you guys a little bit in my video creation process as well, I will put a vote on my Destiny guide video to let you guys vote for which champion guide you want to see next after the guide on the new champion that will be coming soon. And so yeah, that's about it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any questions or thoughts in the comment section below, share this video with your friends, and you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.